So Rob Brodrick is a lay Marianist and the first national director for the Marianist lay community of North America. Prior to joining MLCNA, Dr. Brodrick worked with the Department of Housing and Urban Development's National HMIS Data Lab at the Partnership Center to provide data-driven solutions to preventing and ending homelessness. A native of Southwest Ohio, he's also a founding member and chair of the board of the Mission of Mary Cooperative, which we'll be hearing about, a nonprofit dedicated to increasing food access and sustainable education in local neighborhoods of Dayton, Ohio. Dr. Brodrick holds a BS and an MA from the University of Dayton and a PhD from Boston College. Matthew Philipp Whelan is assistant professor of moral theology in the honors program at Baylor University, where his research centers on Catholic social teaching, Latin American and liberation theologies, and ecological theology and ethics. Besides offering courses on these subjects, he also teaches on scripture, church history, Christian theology and ethics, and both ancient and medieval great texts. Dr. Whelan is the author of the award-winning book, Blood in the Fields, Oscar Romero, Catholic Social Teaching and Land Reform, which argues that Romero's advocacy for justice in the distribution of land, a commitment with deep roots in the Catholic tradition and preserved in Catholic social teaching, illumines the meaning of his witness, along with that of other land and environmental defenders today. So join me in welcoming Dr. Matthew Whelan.
Good morning. Can everyone hear me okay? Yeah, all right. It's an honor to be with you at this conference. I'm so appreciative to Maddie, David, and the Church Properties Initiative for the invitation for a theologian like me to come and talk about Catholic social teaching. Needless to say, this is not the kind of conference I normally attend, and I've really learned so much from doing so, and I hope to continue to attend. At the end of his homily on March 23rd, 1980, Oscar Romero, the sitting Archbishop of San Salvador, El Salvador, said this: "I'd like to make an appeal, especially to the men of the army, and concretely to the National Guard, the police, and the troops. Brothers, you're part of your own people. You're killing your own brother and sister campesinos, peasant farmers. And against any order a man may give to kill, God's law must prevail. You shall not kill. No soldier is obliged to obey an order against the law of God. No one has to observe an immoral law. We want the government to understand well that the reforms are worth nothing if they are stained with so much blood. In the name of God, then, and in the name of this suffering people, whose laments rise up each day more tumultuously towards heaven, I beg you, I beseech you, I order you in the name of God, stop the repression." The following evening, Romero was shot and killed by a sniper as he celebrated Mass, the first bishop killed at the altar since Thomas Becket in the 12th century. "Will no one rid me of this troublesome priest?" is a question attributed to Henry II of England, a question that prompted his knights to murder Becket. In late Cold War El Salvador, many in the political, economic, and military establishment, they asked themselves a similar question about Romero, especially in relationship to the land reform for which he advocated. Romero mentions that advocacy in the homily that I've just quoted when he says that the reforms are worth nothing if they come stained with so much blood. Romero thought the land of El Salvador, and he was thinking primarily but not exclusively of the agricultural land owned by church members. He thought that land was unjustly distributed. The vast majority of Salvadorans were poor, and they had little access to land to farm, so their choice was either to eke out a living on marginal land or migrate. And that unjust distribution of land, Romero thought, fundamentally contradicted the most basic purpose of property and God's intention for creation, which was to foster sharing. In other words, God gave creation, he believed, as a gift for all people, for them to use and enjoy. And for Romero, this meant that Christians should make distinctions between what they needed for themselves and for their dependents and what was in excess of those needs, which they had a special obligation to share, especially with the poor. It was for this reason that Romero supported efforts on the part of the Salvadoran government to establish a more just distribution of land by expropriating the excess land of large landowners and redistributing it to campesinos, the peasant farmers. If the large landowners weren't voluntarily going to share their excess land, the government should help them do it for the sake of the common good, he thought. To use a phrase that's anachronistic, but no less applicable here, Romero was working to realize the right of Salvadorans not to migrate. He wanted them to have access to land to farm so that they didn't have to follow the coffee, cotton, and sugarcane harvests across El Salvador, or to have to move to a different land altogether, like this one, to make ends meet. As Romero described his vision in a late homily, quote, "The land reform must have a broad perspective. It shouldn't just focus on the redistribution of land, but on social goods more generally. It shouldn't just focus on that. Campesinos and the impoverished should also have access to doctors, schools, hospitals, electricity, water, etc." Scholar and essayist Lewis Hyde has written, quote, "How we imagine property is how we imagine ourselves." Romero imagined a people that shared land, property, and other created goods so that they could learn what it meant to share in God's life as revealed in Jesus Christ. I begin with Romero this morning not just because he's a seminal figure and a source of inspiration for Catholics and people of goodwill throughout the world, especially following his recent beatification and canonization. And on this note, I was especially happy to see Pilar Klosky mention him in her presentation on St. Joseph Carpenter Society yesterday, which was excellent. I also begin with Romero because his life and ministry profoundly illuminate Catholic social teaching's understanding of creation and property, an understanding that's oftentimes ignored or misunderstood even by Catholics. It was certainly misunderstood by many wealthy and powerful Catholics in El Salvador who couldn't tell the difference between what Romero was saying and communism, which is why they killed him. So taking the witness of Romero as a point of departure, I'd like to do three main things in my talk this morning. First, I want to explain my central thesis, which is that the imperative of common use is at the heart of how Catholic social teaching understands creation and property. The second thing I'd like to do is examine some key recent developments in social teaching related to what I will call the ecologization of church teaching on the common use of creation, looking at some of its implications for property and the responsibilities incumbent upon possessors. And then third and finally, we'll turn to some specific examples of what this common use looks like before we hear from Rob Brodrick about the Mission of Mary project, and then open the floor, hopefully, to discussion. So first, how does Catholic social teaching understand creation and property? Well, throughout his homilies and writings, we frequently find Romero making claims like, quote, "God has made the earth for all peoples." That, quote, "The products this land produces are for the well-being of the whole community with justice." And, quote, "That sin makes God's beautiful creation groan, which is why the church must continue to cry out that God intended the earth with everything in it for the use of all human beings and peoples." The claim that property is an institution meant to foster the common use of creation isn't just Romero's. It's foundational to the whole Catholic social teaching tradition. Within that tradition, arguably no passage on creation and property is more central than this one from Gaudium et Spes, which means joy and hope, the Vatican II's pastoral constitution of the church in the modern world. And it reads this: "God intended the earth with everything contained in it for the use and the enjoyment of all human beings and peoples." We just saw Romero quote this. "Thus, under the leadership of justice and in the company of charity, created goods should be in abundance for all in a like manner. Whatever the forms of property may be is adapted to the legitimate institutions of peoples. According to diverse and changeable circumstances, attention must always be paid to this universal destination of created goods. In using them, therefore, man should regard the external things that he legitimately possesses not only as his own, but as common, in the sense that they should be able to benefit not only him, but others. On the other hand, the right of having a share of earthly goods sufficient for oneself and one's family belongs to everyone. The fathers and the doctors of the church held this opinion, teaching that men are obliged to come to the relief of the poor and to do so not merely out of their superfluous goods. If one is in extreme necessity, he has the right to procure for himself what he needs out of the riches of others. What Gaudium et Spes is articulating here is often called the common or the universal destination of created goods. And as I mentioned above, it's a belief about creation and property that's at the very foundation, bedrock foundation of Catholic social teaching. John Paul II refers to it as, quote, the first principle of the whole ethical and social order, the, quote, characteristic principle of Christian doctrine. The imperative of common use not only shapes what social teaching has to say about property, but also about work, about markets, about what counts as a just wage, about the vital importance of workers' associations and organizations like unions, and as I've suggested, land reform too. When the tradition invokes the principle of common use, property in arable land is usually the paradigmatic example. For instance, as a direct application of this teaching, Gaudium et Spes discusses the existence in many parts of the world where there are, quote, large or even extensive rural estates which are only slightly cultivated or lie completely idle for the sake of profit, while the majority of the people either are without land or have very small fields, and that these insufficiently cultivated estates should be distributed to those who can make the lands fruitful. This was the rationale for Romero's argument that there should be a more just distribution of land in El Salvador. He was simply applying this teaching. But it's also just as relevant in today's world, right? Where land grabs or large-scale land acquisitions by foreign investors in the global south have surged in recent decades, oftentimes in areas characterized by poverty, hunger, and insecure land tenure. Pope Francis, therefore, continues to insist upon the application of this principle to arable land, stating in his encyclical Laudato Si, Praise be to you, and he's quoting the Paraguayan bishops here, that, quote, every campesino has a natural right to possess a reasonable allotment of land where he can establish his home, work for subsistence of his family, and a secure life. Since working with popular movements, beginning to work more closely with popular movements in 2014, Pope Francis frequently speaks of what he calls los tres T, tierra, techo, y trabajo, the three T's, land, lodging, and labor, and ensuring that all people have access to them. And he has called land reform repeatedly a political necessity and a moral obligation. So while the paradigmatic example for Catholic social teaching is property and land, the relevance of this principle of common use clearly isn't limited to land. Common use is the standard for evaluating all property, whether agricultural land or church buildings, hospitals or homes, clothes or car, real estate, or personal property. In the language of Gaudium et Spes, we should learn to understand and to use our property not as if it's exclusively our own, but as if it's common. It's important to be clear about what this teaching does and does not mean. The description common doesn't necessarily mean that everyone should just give away their private property and live in community, though some can and do pursue this path. This teaching is not suggesting that it's illegitimate to possess what we need for our survival and even our flourishing, or for households to build wealth so that they can provide for themselves and for others. For all of us are members of the community of humankind to whom God gives the gift of creation for common use, which means that all of us can rightfully claim to use what God gives. Rather, the point is that all we have is a gift, which God gives not just for our use, but the use of others through us. And that's why Romero thought that Christians must engage in the difficult work of making distinctions between what they need and what is in excess of their needs. Sharing what is in excess, giving away land, excess salary, opening the doors of our homes and our churches, welcoming strangers into our communities and our countries, providing affordable housing. These are all ways we can and do acknowledge that there are others to whom God gives the gift of creation, others to whom we are bound simply by virtue of membership in the community of humankind. In making distinctions and decisions about how we use what we have, we must always take others into account. The teaching on common use issues a profound challenge that neither eradicates private property nor does it leave it wholly intact. It unsettles the lines we habitually draw between what is mine and what belongs to others. For instance, when I drive to work and see someone on the side of the road asking for money, this teaching compels me to ask myself whether the money I have on me is mine or theirs. Similarly, this teaching unsettles the borders we draw between nations. For instance, when migrants come to the place where I live, this teaching compels me to find ways to welcome them and to work for their survival and their flourishing. Simply put, for Catholic social teaching, property is an institution that's given by God for common use, to establish a common humanity and foster community. It's given by God to build bridges between people, not walls, to support a common life, not a divided one. This understanding of creation and the God who gives it is why Pope Francis repeatedly says things like this: as the doors of God's mercy are always open, the doors of our churches, our communities, our parishes, our institutions, our dioceses must be open, because this is how we can all go out to bring this mercy of God. So we've been examining the principle of common use and its centrality to Catholic social teaching, and we've seen how Romero relied on this belief about creation to advocate for a more just distribution of land in El Salvador. But I've also been trying to suggest that this belief can speak to us today, and not just about agricultural land, but about how we understand and use property more generally. The social teaching tradition continues to insist upon this, right? Pope Francis discusses it at length in his most recent encyclical, Fratelli Tutti. At the same time, as I suggested above, this teaching about common use has developed, and in novel ways in recent decades. And it's this development that I want to examine briefly now. More specifically, what I want to suggest is that we see a subtle but unmistakable ecologization in how Catholic social teaching understands common use. An ecologization that indelibly shapes the tradition's understanding of property and the responsibilities upon its possessors. The German zoologist Ernst Haeckel first coined the term ecology in the 19th century for the science that studies interactions between organisms and their environment. But the etymological root of the word ecology points to the interrelationships we share with each other and with non-human creatures in a common home. And so when I speak about ecologization of social teaching on common use, it's this more expansive understanding of ecology and not just ecological science to which I'm referring. While the ecologization of Catholic social teaching begins decades earlier, it's very far along by the time we get to Pope Benedict XVI's 2008 encyclical Caritas in Veritate, or Charity in Truth. Consider this passage. The environment is God's gift to everyone, and in our use of it, we have a responsibility towards the poor, towards future generations, and towards humanity as a whole. In nature, the believer recognizes the wonderful work or the wonderful result of God's creative activity, which we may responsibly use for our legitimate needs, material or otherwise, while respecting the intrinsic balance of creation. If this vision is lost, we either end up considering nature an untouchable taboo, or on the contrary, abusing it. Neither vision is consonant with the Christian vision of nature as the fruit of God's creation. Nature expresses a design of love and truth. It's prior to us. It's been given to us by God as the setting for our life. Nature speaks to us of the Creator and his love for humanity. It's destined to be recapitulated in Christ at the end of time. It's at our disposal, not as a heap of scattered refuse, but as a gift of the Creator who has given it an inbuilt order, enabling man to draw from it the principles needed in order to till and to keep it. The natural environment is more than raw material to be manipulated for our pleasure. It's a wondrous work of the Creator containing a grammar which sets forth ends and criteria for its wise use. There's a whole lot to unpack here. The first thing to notice is the thematic continuity with previous teaching. For instance, that creation is a gift God gives for common use, and that acknowledging the commonality of the gift means assessing the legitimate needs that we have and sharing what we have in excess with others, especially the poor. And at the same time, a close reading of this passage side by side with Gaudium et Spes reveals novelties. Above, I spoke about how the teaching on common use challenges and unsettles the lines we ordinarily draw between what belongs to me and others, as well as the boundaries between nations. In this passage, we see Caritas in Veritate challenging and unsettling two aspects of previous teaching. First, it's challenging and unsettling Gaudium et Spes' assumed temporal frame. I'll say more about that in a minute. And second, it's challenging and unsettling a particular version of anthropocentrism or human-centeredness. Let's begin with the assumed temporal frame. You'll recall from Gaudium et Spes that God's gift of creation is for the use of all human beings and peoples, but in the present, right? In other words, Gaudium et Spes assumes what we might call a presentism, by which I mean the assumption that the primary recipients of the gift are the current generation of people living. And on this view, the primary issue is how to facilitate a more equitable sharing of property among those who are alive today, right? That's certainly what Romero thought. But notice how there's no sense that the all to whom God gives the gift of creation for common use also includes our future neighbors. In other words, there's no sense that God's giving of the gift unfolds across time. The fact that it clearly does so in Caritas in Veritate inescapably raises questions about how we care for the lands, the buildings, the goods we possess so that they will be available to those who will come after us and who will also need to make use of them. The inner logic of Benedict's view raises questions like, how do we use this land so that future generations won't find its soil exhausted, its water depleted, and its habitat for other creatures eliminated? How do we build ways that endure and from sources that are renewable? How do we make goods that aren't designed to be discarded soon after they're made? How do we purchase in ways that support such attentive and careful use of God's creation? Caritas in Veritate also challenges and unsettles another aspect of church teaching, previous church teaching, what we might call a certain version of anthropocentrism, or once again, human-centeredness. For much of its history, the social teaching tradition has tended to imagine the realities of social life as if the only creatures of relevance were human ones. Gaudium et Spes' focus on ensuring that all human beings and peoples can make use of creation is representative of this view. But in the passage above, in this passage, Benedict is suggesting something more, and we see creatures other than human ones coming into view in a much more focused way. According to Benedict, creation and its creatures aren't just gifts to be made use of by us. The natural world itself, he suggests, has a purpose apart from us. It expresses a design of love and truth, he says. And if we have eyes to see it, the creation has an inbuilt order or grammar, rules that govern its use. Moreover, if he contends that if we attend to it carefully, its creatures, its principles, its processes, we can learn something about how to till and to keep it well. It might even impart to us a wisdom about how we might use it. Above, I was careful to say that Caritas in Veritate challenges and unsettles a certain version of anthropocentrism, because you'll notice that Benedict's view is still very anthropocentric. It's still centered upon the human. But it's a centering upon the human that's different from what we find in Gaudium et Spes, which largely ignores other creatures. And it's different yet from still other forms of anthropocentrism that we find in our world today, which practically regard other creatures as raw material to be manipulated at our pleasure. So in contrast, for Benedict, we must carefully attend to the wider creaturely world, as well as keep it while we use it, because of the responsibilities we bear to other humans, to the poor, to future generations, to the whole of humankind, he says. What Benedict is pointing to, I think, is an anthropocentrism that includes care for God's creation within it. It's an anthropocentrism that does not set human and non-human creatures over and against one another as if there was a competition between them. It's a vision of common use within the context of a common home we share with God's other creatures, and to use Pope Francis' language from Laudato Si, within a common home. It's a vision that regards the good of humans and the good of other creatures as integrally related to one another. It reveals to us that enacting our responsibilities to one another in the present and in the future isn't really possible without also and at the same time caring for creatures upon which we all depend and from which we draw our lives. For our relationships with God and with one another are always interwoven with the rest of the creaturely world. Works of mercy, for instance, giving food, drink, shelter, clothing to one another, inescapably involve us with other creatures and their use, with land, with soil, with watersheds, with forests. As embodied creatures, we simply cannot love, eat, purchase, work, or do much of anything without this involvement. In short, on this view, we must ultimately value both humans and the wider creation, or we value neither. So Russell Hittinger, the great scholar of Catholic social teaching, describes the tradition as developing by way of clarification and application. Clarification of its key terms and concepts and their application to a changing world. And in my talk this morning, I've been trying to highlight an important example of this process of development as it relates to social teaching on the common use of creation and its ecologization through time. A true ecological approach, Francis observes in Laudato Si, always becomes a social approach. It must integrate questions of justice and debates on the environment so as to hear both the cry of the earth and the cry of the poor, he says in Laudato Si. And this is true. But the development in Catholic social teaching that I've been tracing this morning is actually the inverse of what Pope Francis says here. It's actually about a social approach also becoming an ecological one as the tradition gradually learns to acknowledge that what it means to be human and what it means to live in society with one another requires that we care for a home that we share with other creatures. What does all this mean in more practical terms? Well, the world today is filled with Catholics, other Christian communities, and people of goodwill caring for a common home in ways I've just been describing. For those who are connected to the St. Kateri Tekakwitha Society, they replace their lawns with native vegetation that provides food for people, habitat for pollinators and other creatures, and spaces for meditation and prayer. Quote, "People have to learn to love the earth before they can save it," one of their members said. And they begin where they are, in the homes where they live. Here at Notre Dame, your own Father Manuel Katongole, who's with us today, is one of the founders of the Bethany Land Institute in Uganda. The institute provides the rural poor in Uganda with 2-year residential integrated educational program in regenerative agriculture and economic entrepreneurship, trying to train people to tackle simultaneously the challenges of environmental degradation, hunger, and poverty. Where I live, in Waco, Texas, it's the Baptists who are leading the way. Daystring Baptist Church has started a composting initiative on church grounds for all its members while also restoring natural habitat, planting veggie gardens, and sheltering migrant families from Central America, all on their land as a church. They explicitly cultivate love of neighbor and love of community by tilling and keeping the earth. Examples could be multiplied. I've heard additional ones even over the course of this conference, and I know many of you know of many more. There's not just one way to care for the common home we share. But what's crucial to see is that all these communities in different ways are responding to the complex social environmental crisis of our time by integrating care of the land upon which they live, work, and worship into their very sense of identity and mission. They're pursuing alternative models of land use that actually keep the earth as they till it, often working for an agri-food system that prioritizes nutritious food and feeding the community. They are explicitly integrating justice and ecology, simultaneously responding to both to the cry of the earth and the cry of the poor. And they unapologetically root their efforts in Christian conviction and mission. And in doing so, these communities and so many others like them throughout the world show us the way towards common use for a common home. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Whelan. For those I haven't got to meet yet, my name is Rob. I'm the National Director of the Marianist lay communities, and I'm here to talk about the Mission of Mary Cooperative for just a moment. The goal in doing so is hopefully to do a slightly deeper dive into an example of at least what I hope Professor Whelan can grade me at the end and see how well we've done. But it's an organization that's inspired by these ideals of common use and integral ecology in Dayton, Ohio. So what this is, it's an urban farming initiative of the Marianists that seeks for food access, sustainability, education, and native land restoration in an underserved and impoverished neighborhood on the east side of Dayton. Dayton, Ohio. So we're about 4 miles from here, a little closer than maybe some of the projects in Central America, right? But this goes on here, right, in our country as well. To explain this problem, right, this is a very geographic specific problem that I'm going to talk about, and it may not make sense for those of us coming in from places like Los Angeles or places where the urban core looks a little more dense than Dayton, Ohio. The Midwest in the United States, as many of us know, has suffered a long period of decay, and I think of it often in terms of a donut, right? We have a population that's moved from the urban core towards the suburbs, leaving the interior often very vacant. So the neighborhood that I'm talking about, you're going to see vacancy rates when we moved in between 30 and 40% of land and lots completely unused. By that I don't mean there's a nice sitting building on it, right? By that I mean sometimes it's vacant land, sometimes it's colloquially referred to as a crack house, right? It's so far gone, right, that it's used for drugs or other illicit activities. So that's kind of what's going on in these kind of neighborhoods. If you could have afforded to move out, you have, right? These are also in our neighborhoods, historically Catholic neighborhoods, right? So the population moving up was one of the populations with the highest upward economic mobility in the United States, and that is Catholics, right? They went to their Catholic schools, they achieved an upward economic mobility, and they moved out to the suburbs, right? So that's kind of who we're talking about. So there's a large Catholic church in our neighborhood that people used to attend, and sometimes they still come in from the suburbs to go see it, right? But otherwise, that's the presence kind of the church that we're talking about. So I think a lot of us are familiar with this, but for those of us that aren't, that's kind of what we're looking at. So we move in, the Marianists kind of move in and have an intentional kind of community. And we're looking around and we're seeing, these issues in the neighborhood in this sort of post-industrial Midwest. And we realize how many of the social issues going on, crime, drugs, prostitution, so on, are related to the vacant land situation. Here's 2 examples. So the first lot that we're going to start using, and it'll show up on some pictures later, is a lot, it's about a 1-acre site that was a filled-in swimming pool behind our house. The first thing that caught our attention within several weeks of moving in was a stolen car that had been lit on fire and pushed down the hill. It was done to cover up the tracks of who stole it after they stripped it for parts. This was actually a pretty common activity, right? We quickly learned that another corner, we quickly learned which corners of the lot are used for which. There's some homeless guys on one corner, and we were a house of hospitality. We eventually worked with them in a certain capacity. There was a drug corner, there was a prostitution corner. This is all on a little 1-acre site of urban land, but so overgrown. I mean, there are trees, right? This has been sitting there for 40 years untouched, right, and undevelopable, given the swimming pool underneath, given some other, restrictions. Especially including the economic restrictions on doing that, right? So that's a kind of lot, right? Shady people go to shady places to do shady things, right? So we got to be careful about where we're looking at our land. But here's another thing, right? So there's also these other spirals in here that took us a little while to understand what was going on. Our neighborhood had the highest rates of arson in the city. And we go, okay, well, we know where that's coming in from, punk kids and their gangs, something like that. That's not what it was. This really caught us by surprise. We started noticing this by talking with other neighbors and you can see the pattern. No one really owns up to this, but you start catching on after a while. So if you have families, right, the only families living in this neighborhood are those who cannot afford to leave the neighborhood. And if they're sitting next to a house that is dangerous, the kids can't go outside. This is dangerous. The lot out back is dangerous, right? There is danger in these vacant lots, right? The city can't afford to get rid of these lots. Why can't the city afford to do this? Well, because they're vacant and nobody's been paying taxes on them for 40 years. They don't have the infrastructure and resources to do this. So what a really, I'm going to say good way to get this to the top of the list. I don't know, this is a morally good way to get this to the top of the list, but it is efficient. You can get this to the city's, top of the city's, let's bulldoze this lot within 5 minutes. Cost you a couple gallons of gas and a match. Right? That's where the arson was coming from. It was families trying to protect their children from the crack houses. Right? That's what was going on, which is a tremendous spiral of, difficulty, I'll say. Right? This is a really difficult situation. So we're not here to try to cast moral judgments on this. We're trying to say, what do we do with this vacant land situation? Okay? So that's where our cooperative comes in. So we start getting this idea of urban farming out of this. I'm going to show just a couple slides to show what's become of this. So we start reclaiming land from the city. And this happens through a number of different processes. When you have 40 years of back taxes on something, you have to work with the county and say, hi, we're poor, we have this newly formed nonprofit, will you just give it to us and wipe the taxes? Sometimes it would be owned by another church who just lets us use this. So we have a non-denominational church on our block who owns some of these properties. Some of these are cooperative agreements that I'll talk about a little bit later with some community development organizations. But it's going to look like this. This is our neighborhood from the all-seeing eye of Google Earth. You can see, I know it's really hard because it's very, zoomed out. We have, there's really 5 different sites that are all kind of circled in purple. The farms, the arable land, now the growing land, the land we grow on is in yellow. So we have 5 total sites throughout this neighborhood, right? So there's probably about 13 different, what the city would call, lots, but then they're smashed together to form these 5 different sites. Just for a perspective, kind of, these ones in the bottom right corner are about 5 acres each, right? So this is a somewhat large neighborhood, but we're getting a number of things. So an urban farm doesn't look like a rural farm, right? A rural farm is one big kind of square out there, right? We're this patchwork of available lots scattered throughout the neighborhood. What do we do? First, community-supported agriculture, for anyone that gets a CSA box, right, a community-supported agriculture box, it is a box of produce. We do this, for those that know Tom's Shoes, we kind of liked that model, right? They sell a pair of shoes and they give one away for free. We sell one box of very overpriced vegetables to people who know that they're buying overpriced vegetables. They live out in the suburb and they buy those. And then there's a steep neighborhood discount. We started with free, but if it's free, it's undervalued, so we have to charge something, usually still in SNAP benefits. So we do that. That's part of food access, right? There's a number of other ways in which we try to get produce out to the neighborhood. We'll try any means to distribute any trick possible to eat your veggies. It feels like working with small children sometimes, but that's our goal. We do backyard gardens, right? So this is part of the sustainability initiative, right? So if you can, the more sustainable you are, we sometimes think sustainable kind of comes in as an upper, middle class virtue, right? But it also really works for people who are poor, right? Because if you're growing your own food and if you're preserving your own energy, right, things cost a whole lot less and that's more stable for your family. So we try to do education in that kind of mode. So they start just by doing their own gardens in their backyard, right? That's a first step towards food sustainability. Produce prescriptions, this is kind of my favorite. We partner up with local dietetics agencies, so they go meet with a doctor, they meet with a dietitian, and then we give them prescription veggies. This is, them in this case is pregnant mothers. So this is really great, right, because we know there's a whole, field, and I'm sure a lot of people know about how important that's going to be for pregnant mothers to be properly nourished, right? in this. We partner with local schools, so there's always little kids out on the lot. This is my favorite part by far, seeing folks from the local Ruskin Elementary School out there digging in the land and just learning, where does food come from, right? We asked them to name the gardens. One of them wanted to call it Hamburger Garden. It was like, well, this is where the hamburgers grow, right? And so there's a lot of explaining of how food works in this and how food systems work. You really get it when they're touching things. We host neighborhood events. This is great music out on the land, right? This is just part of we want people to feel like they own this. This is their farm, right? There was an initial problem early on. People would come in and steal the produce. So everyone says, great, put up a fence. I'll donate the fence. We said, no fences, right? This is their land. They're going to come on it. We're going to have a discussion about what's going on with the food and how you can get this, they're picking underripe stuff. We're like, at least wait until we pick it when it's ripe. This is the goal, right? So having neighborhood events on there, it just says, this is your land as much as it's our land. Be here, be welcome. And then finally, we have this exciting partnership up on one of our sites. It's called Lincoln Hill. There was an old school. The school was taken down. This is a partnership between 4 different entities. One is us, Mission of Mary Cooperative. We grow food on this site. This is currently they're breaking ground on a lot of this next month. We're really excited. The University of Dayton is putting in an outdoor eco lab so their students can come and engage on our lots. We have an orchard and some of our plots here. They're breaking ground next month on a 5-star preschool that's going to go in. So the university students and the preschoolers are going to interact along with us and other community partners. And a community development corporation owns this lot and helps manage all of these partners, right? So this is a really cool partnership. We're really excited about these kind of ideas. And this brings me to the last sort of point. I started by saying I'm a Marianist, so what is that? Right, so this is one of the charisms or spiritualities in the Catholic Church, and we're really focused on the ideals of community. Right, and where do we get this idea from? We're formed in the wake of the French Revolution. We're saying, okay, well, how do we go and recreate the church, right? In the wake of this really traumatic event, we say, okay, we need to focus on, intentional communities. Why? Well, this is what happens even in the scriptures, right? One of our favorite biblical characters is Mary of Nazareth, right? You see her throughout. She's always bringing Christ to the world, and she's doing this through community building, through her stability, through her presence. We say, okay, how do we do that? Now, this is really interesting. One of the other things you notice about Mary, though, she's always, we would say, we talk about ourselves as a partner and catalyst. She's always a partner from the very beginning, right? So she's got a life partner, right? St. Joseph. Right? And this is really interesting. I want everyone to remember back, our neighborhood looks a lot like Camden, New Jersey, right? So we heard this great presentation for those of you who were in here the second session yesterday, and there was an organization working on building the houses. Now, you didn't see us building houses, right? We're saying, okay, that's another part of this, right? We can't just do the urban farming. We have to have an integrated approach with all of these other folks, right? And that's where these partnerships come in. That organization, of course, yesterday was the St. Joseph's Carpenter Society, and I love that. I said, there it is. Right? That's also part of what the Catholic approach to these neighborhoods is. It's not, a thing like Mission of Mary. Mary's not there building community alone, right? We also have St. Joseph in there. And we have a lot of other folks coming in there as well. But I really loved that partnership from yesterday. Just when I kind of had that visual, I was like, oh, there it is right there. We have the carpenter and we have the community builder together in the neighborhood. That's what we're really striving to do. So I'm hoping that this is going to illustrate a little bit of the idea of common use. I'm going to invite at this point Dr. Whelan back up, and we're going to have a little conversation about this and then open up to comments and questions as well from you all. Thanks for your time. All right. So, Matthew, I really enjoyed your talk. I think there was a lot of richness and a lot of depth to the idea of common use as you were talking about it. And I think you did a wonderful job of unpacking it. I also still find it dense sometimes when I think about it. So I've tried to put up one example, and I appreciate that you brought a couple of others. Do you think you could just unpack that a little bit more? Because I do think sometimes we just hear that common use and we say, okay, this has to be, is this land that has to be owned in common, right? Or are we talking about all, ownership of things has to be private, right? In Mission of Mary case, our first job was to try to figure out how to own these lots to protect them. Is that a valid kind of use as you're seeing this idea of common use?
Yeah, absolutely, completely. And then, by the way, A+ on You asked about the grade, yeah, for sure. Yeah, no, absolutely. That's something I passed over, I think, fairly quickly. I mean, the common use notion can lead to the impression that relinquished private property is, on the model of the early Christian communities described in the book of Acts, right? Everyone owns in common. And that is a legitimate example of common use. There are people to this day that do live that way. Religious communities, otherwise, they don't own private property. They own all their land, all their possessions in common. But for the laity, for others, that's not the approach, right? And there are ways of thinking about common use in which others, the laity, people that have families, others, they can own property legitimately. The Catholic Church believes this. But the issue is seeing their property not as exclusively their own, but as given to share, right? So that's why you would be hospitable in your home. You would open your doors to other people. There's a kind of way of thinking about property that understands that it has a social function, right? That it's meant to cultivate community in your neighborhood. This is how churches function. This is how our households function, right? These are ways of opening property so that others can have the use and the access of it too. In other words, others can sort of share in the use of it, right? That's how the designation common functions in that way. Does that make sense?
That makes a lot of sense,
Okay.
I think. What else are you thinking about when you're looking at these examples, or are there any questions that you have?
Yeah, well, I'm really interested, actually. Can I ask you a question?
Absolutely.
Yeah, I'd be very interested in hearing a little bit more about the cooperative structure of Mission Mary, but also how it was that the community gardening piece, as well as the urban gardening piece, how that sort of came to function in the ways that it did within the cooperative structure of your mission.
Yeah. So, and this does come about through an intentional community. So we were living in a kind of Catholic worker style, and that's how this got done. A lot of sweat equity, at the beginning in this, and that's kind of what made this possible. We've transitioned over time, we had to form a 501c3 so that we could own some of this land, and we could receive it and work out those deals with the city. And there was a real struggle when we went to make that move, right? Because we're saying, okay, now we're going to corporatize, and there's certain things that are now required in that, and we're going to try to scale up. Now we need to hire employees, and we need to pay fair, just wages, right? So there's all these things that you got to do and are good to do, right? But that really challenged the idea for us. We said, okay, now how is this? The other idea was we really wanted these places to be, as I was saying before, a sense of ownership, from the community. Right. So if we're saying, okay, now this is our thing, and we have to do some amount of protecting it. If you give everything away for free, I now can't pay the employees, right? And I have an obligation to them, right? So now we're kind of cut. This is a kind of, that was a real moment for us, and it's something we still continue to work on. So I think one of the things that helps us, though, right, is if I draw out our financial sheet, it'll look like 1/3 social enterprise, 1/3 donors, 1/3 grants, right? But 2/3 of that, really, in the way that we work with folks, right, I think are people who feel that they have ownership, in this. They are people who live in the neighborhood. They are people who are part of our broader Marianist community, right? They're saying, oh, we are that Catholic population who moved out to the suburbs, right? But we're still going to be now invested in this community. This is our city. This is also our neighborhood. This is also our responsibility for being here. So that's what we're really trying to do, and I think it does work. It does get more complicated, and you have to really have in this case, a board, but a community who's really thinking and invested in these kind of issues. So we spend a lot of time at our board meetings just trying to talk about, there's more theology, I think, that goes on sometimes, and then we're like, okay, also the spreadsheets, right? But that's really important, or else we would not have gotten to that kind of place, it really feels that way.
Rob's one of the rare people that actually gets a PhD in theology to do the kind of work that he is doing in this community. I mean, something else I'm just really interested in hearing more about are the challenges that you guys face currently. What would you say are the main ones in implementing your vision? But also, what are your hopes? 5, 10, 15 years, what do you hope that this could be?
Great, thanks. We'll do this, and then we will open up for questions. So if anyone has a question after this one, it's to you. So challenges, they've shifted early on. I think, well, early on there was just, I mean, we didn't even know, we didn't set out to say we're going to do an urban farm. So the first challenge was really listening to the community and the work of intentional presence. A lot of people over for dinner, a lot of sitting with people, a lot of patience, as everyone tells you their thoughts about things, and that can go on for some time. The challenges then shifted as we scaled up to that nonprofit mode, and there were a number of challenges. I would just like to flag for folks who have real estate knowledge, like get invested in some of these neighborhood things. There were some things we did not know that I was hearing other people talk about later. For instance, we did not know, we got our tax exemption from the IRS. That actually wasn't too hard to do. Getting it from the county for the land use was really hard. We did not understand that there was a difference between land use, and we said, well, the IRS said we're tax exempt, so we can just apply this to the, and they said, nope, that looks like a farm. A farm is not a nonprofit use of a land, buy, and we couldn't afford the taxes on the land, so that was rough. So we had a whole team of us coming up to Columbus to, petition this, and that was, the judge was like, there's a lot of people here for like a small amount of land. I was like, this means a lot. That could have been avoided, right? Like if like most of the people in this room were like involved right here. If we had known you and you'd have known us, you'd have said, guys, this is not how you fill out these forms. And that was a year of us like really working on this, because we're like, this goes under real quick. We have like no money, right? If we have to start paying all these taxes that we can't afford on this, right? So there's real use. So there are real technical challenges. At this point, we've got some of those technical challenges figured out. We're excited about that. The challenge comes back to community. At this point, we have figured out how to grow produce in land that it probably ought not be growing on. We've figured that out. We have figured out how to work out property relations in a neighborhood where maybe that ought not be able to happen. We've figured out those technical issues, but it comes back now to the people. And that's always the hardest thing. How are we using this, right? How does food access, how does sustainability education actually make a difference for people, right? Because again, we're basically saying to a lot of people, eat your veggies, and people don't like being told that, right? Especially if they're hooked on Wendy's, right? Like if that's your own source of caloric intake, that's addictive, So it's like, how do we work with this and make it easy and accessible, to them? So it's constantly coming back to the people as our challenge. What questions do we have for? You can go either way.
Yeah, thank you, gentlemen, for the great presentations. And the universal destination of goods is something I firmly understand and believe in, and it's clearly a deep part of the social teaching of the church. I wanted to propose maybe a different emphasis and get your reactions, and that's the position of private property, because I think John Paul II and many of the others have emphasized the importance of private property in the encyclicals on social teaching and as a means of upward mobility, truly. And so I wanted to say that it seems that part of what would be consistent with what you're saying and with private property is to see ownership of private property as a stewardship. And I think that's implicit in what you're saying, a stewardship of private property. Because a lot of times the notions of expropriation are done in a means that actually reduces the usability and viability of the private property, whether it's personal property or real estate. And in fact, when certain wealthy persons who might better understand universal destination of goods, but also understand good stewardship and utilization, have the property, it can actually be used better to elevate the poor than just simply distributing it in ownership to the poor. And I think of some of the people we would think of as the wealthiest in the world, the Buffetts of the world and so forth. It seems to me that their ownership and control of private property is allowing it to be used for job creation, wealth creation, and upward mobility of hundreds of thousands of people across the world and their families. And so I just wanted to present that notion of private property and what seems to be consistent with the social teaching on universal destination of goods and gauge your reaction.
Thank you for that question. I mean, you'll notice that I was quoting Pope John Paul II on the universal destination of created goods several times, where he said that it's the foundational principle of Catholic social teaching that's the central principle of the whole Christian social order. So I think that Pope John Paul II, he of course talks about private property, as of course does the whole social teaching tradition, but he understands private property, I think, different than mainstream understandings of what counts as private property. I think he would wholly endorse everything that I just tried to explain, which is that private property is always indexed to social goods. It's always indexed to building up communities, and it always has a social function. It's central to the whole Catholic social teaching tradition. You know, I think also, I mean, again, on this view, it's not, you know, you bring up the case of expropriation, and that's a really good example. The development of the social teaching tradition was actually deeply ambivalent on embracing in the 1940s, during the pontificate of Pius XII, this notion of expropriating excess land holdings through land reform. That's when it first comes into the Catholic social teaching tradition. But it's also important, two things about that real quick, and then I'll stop. The first thing is that the problem there was that the Catholic social teaching tradition, you know, Leo XIII, Pius XI, they kept on talking about the obligation of private landowners and property owners for the common good, but it wasn't happening. They weren't doing what the church was teaching. So by the 1940s, the situation had gotten so bad that that's when the social teaching tradition first starts saying, okay, well, maybe we need to begin to think about expropriation of land now. That's how that emerges, and it has continued ever since then. That there are governments that promote goods through land reform in certain cases. The second thing to say about that is, in the case of Oscar Romero, I mean, the land reform plunged the whole country into bloodshed. It occasioned a civil war. And at the end of Romero's life, he was deeply, deeply ambivalent about this measure for the reasons that you've just been talking about, right? On the one hand, the land needs to serve the people of El Salvador, but pursuing this in this way is leading the country deeper into violence. And he dies in the midst of that ambivalence. And I think that that's the ambivalence we live in many ways. Do you have anything to add to that?
Oh, no, that's good. Let's take another, we've got more questions.
So, in terms of shared goods, common property, who are the people in the world where the people we might think of are not necessarily in the church anymore, exclusively, as they might more or less once have been?
So if I understand your question correctly, like, is it that...
If the property is for the people,
yeah.
Are we drawing boundaries around who those people are, or is it all people regardless of who
all
they are?
people, yeah. It has nothing, these are claims that are not tied to belonging in particular groups. They're claims tied to belonging in the community of human.
And so what are the implications then for us as we think about how to, what do we need to change in terms of our thinking or practices, or how do we create, I don't know if we need nuances, but how do we create some ways for sort of thinking through this property is going to be reused for, you know, the parish, the congregation, versus this is going to be used for a wider community that may not have a relationship to us?
I mean, there's no specific rules for this, right? I mean, there's not a recipe, but the central claim is that creation is a gift for all people, and therefore we have special responsibilities to those who are deprived of access to the goods of creation. So there's special responsibilities incumbent upon thinking and considering and integrating the poor. But what exactly that looks like, there's no specification. Land reform would be one example. In a lot of the world, this is why the Catholic social teaching increasingly insists upon this, because people who are farmers don't have access to land, and so that's why the teaching continues to insist upon this. But the centrality of the preferential option for the poor, considering the poor, is crucial, yeah.
Yes, go for over here.
I know, it's me again. So, you know, I brought this question up yesterday when we were going through and saying how should we be disposing of this? And it is really, as we're looking at the assets of the Catholic Church and understanding the social teaching of the Catholic Church. We need to make sure that we're answering all these questions to ensure that the models that we're putting forth and the boundaries that we're setting up of ensuring that the most value hits the people, because there is greed and excess in all of these transactions that we're talking about. And I can say this because I've watched the Little Sisters of the Poor. I've watched our nuns take a vow of poverty, and they're trying to maintain their ministries, and they're struggling. And the first thing that happens is developers come in and say, we'll fix it. We'll make you go further into debt, and we'll build things, instead of helping them move forward. And sometimes there is building. It's not evil. It's not what I'm saying, but it's who are you? I live this all the time, and it breaks my heart. And these sisters lived off of $60 a month all their lives. And yes, they live in community. And you have to understand that it's not just the property, it's the ministries and the social services that are there, that people have committed their lives. And we are now at the doorstep as laity to try to manage ourselves and what we feel we're entitled to ensure those people who have nothing, right? It's not a preaching thing, but how do you tie that together? Because I think that this is so important, and it needs to link into an understanding of not just how to get your property tax exemptions. Like, all of these are toolkits, but we need an ethical toolkit to help guide our ministries to ensure that we're doing this the right way. We need a framework. We need guidelines of saying not to exceed, because the minute you start to exceed, I've watched this in New York in nursing homes, right? When you're going to operate at a 2.8 staffing ratio, residents are going to be impacted. We've always operated at 3.5, so residents are getting better care. It's all because of the profit motive. And that's all I can say is that how do we fix that? Because this is a once in a lifetime opportunity right now where we're handing out or redeploying or handing over our assets to individuals who aren't necessarily vowed religious and committed to the same level that these sisters were. Or maybe they are. I don't want to make a judgment there, but I know I don't live off of $60 a month, right?
Yeah, can I make I think I have two remarks about this, and I'm not sure that it's going to address what to do with the sisters, right? But one of the trends here, right, is we're also talking about lay people getting in the game, right, and taking all of this really seriously. And I think that there's at least two things that I see, because you're right, you know, all of a sudden when you have lay people and say, well, I'm going home and I've got kids, right, you know, and family to take care of. $60 a month doesn't really do very well for that. So there's two things. One, it changes where sometimes I think the onus of some moral conversation is. In the past, I think a lot of just Catholic donations have gone to, you know, religious organizations. We automatically trust them, and for some reason, because they have these vows of poverty, people don't trust me in the same way. I don't have a vow of poverty. They say, I don't know you. I don't know, you know, who are you like beholden to, and who's keeping you from just running away with all of that, right? So one, transparency. As we move, right, this is going to become an increasing church value, right, where we go from saying we trust these because of certain moral formations to also we need to build in structures of transparency. That is huge as the laity get into the game, right, because that's where a lot of that trust comes from. Second, relationship building, right? So I'm with the lay association. The lay associations aren't, you know, united in a way to get together. We don't meet once annually like the superior generals, you know, all do from religious congregations. We need to start doing that, right, because we need to be able to exchange this kind of information, say, here's what I'm doing. I don't think I'm doing it right. Who's doing this better, right? And we need access to doing that. So there's just a couple reflections on the laity getting in that game. We can do one more question, I think, and then we'll have to take the rest from outside.
I had a chance to talk to both of you over the last couple of days, and I was impressed, but I realized you were being very humble, and you're doing great work. So I've been working on land access through the nonprofit sector for 25 years, and I have a comment and a question. The comment is, you know, the Catholic Church has been ahead of everybody in terms of advocating for campesinos in this country, with advocacy for the farmer training programs at USDA and farmer worker overtime, but I don't think that's really trickled down to looking at how land owned by the churches can be available for farmers and also farm worker housing. But the question is, when we think about, what the use of properties that we've been talking about the last few days, I mean, I think we can all think of things that we would not consider a good fit for a Catholic-owned property in terms for use of a building. But what about vacant land? I mean, what kinds of farming techniques? And what if a diocese was to have a policy, we will only lease to farmers that are using carbon farming techniques or carbon sequestration techniques or organic techniques? What would that look like, and do you think it's a good idea?
It sounds really good to me. I don't know that I have I'm like, that sounds really good. I don't know that I have a follow-up besides that.
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely an argument that sort of the techniques you've just described are deeply compatible, consonant even with the kinds of things that Benedict XVI says in that encyclical that I was quoting, right? That there's a kind of integrity to the sort of ecological order that we can actually learn something from. The approach that I'm most familiar with, a lot of my work has been focused recently on agroecology as sort of very much an approach to agriculture that works in a similar kind of vein as the Catholic social teaching tradition. So I've been arguing for quite some time now that those committed to Catholic social teaching need to take agroecology much more seriously in this way. And I think you're exactly right that these kinds of questions should be raised in the United States. Just really briefly, because I know we're out of time, in the UK, I'm part of a group that's asking very similar kinds of questions about the use of the land of religious congregations. They own a lot of it. How can we enable access for farmers who are trying to get into who are land poor that don't have access to land? So there are places in the world where these questions are live and trying to be implemented. So,
Thank you.
And that's going to conclude our session here. Are there any instructions that we need to get rid of?
So the last hour will be back in the smaller rooms, and they'll begin at 11. So another quick.
Thank you all.